This was one of the worst incidents of racial violence in U.S. history.
An unruly white mob destroyed part of this city, which was the Black community.
They had just gained their freedom. They're just getting a foothold and building something for themselves and for their futures. And within 2 days, in the most horrific way, everything that they hoped for was gone.
You have people a generation out of slavery who built something that no one else could have done.
African Americans in Tulsa, Oklahoma should have those same banners above their hotels, above their barbershops that say since the 19-teens, and yet they don't.
We know that no white person was ever held accountable for any offense relative to that.
There was government-sanctioned torture and terrorism. That's the history of Tulsa, going back to the 1921 massacre. And Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma have never made amends for that.
If you don't know your history, it will repeat itself. Well, it's repeating itself.
It is terrifying because you realize that it could happen today.
The militia represented Saturday before last is the exact same mob that was represented in 1921 when the massacre took place.
I guess the great hope is that this will never happen again if you tell the story. But until they obtain justice for this massacre, there can't be healing.
Deneen Brown, welcome to American Black Journal.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So I want to start with just the idea of the attention that the Tulsa Massacre is now getting. It's been a long time that this has been buried in American history. And I just want to get your reaction to the fact that people are starting to wake up to what happened. There's conversations going on about maybe trying to repair some of the damage that was done to African Americans there in Tulsa. Just give me a sense of how that feels to finally be getting some idea of attention for this really important historical event.
Yes, so for nearly 100 years, the Tulsa Race Massacre, which began on May 31st, 1921, and ended on June 1st, 1921, for nearly 100 years, it was covered up. There was a concerted conspiracy of silence by civic leaders and city leaders in Tulsa. Just years after the massacre, many white people just would not talk about it, and Black people would whisper about it for fear that it might happen again. The Tulsa Race Massacre, as you know, is one of the worst single incidents of racial violence committed against Black people in US history. It is amazing. Black activists in Tulsa tell me that it is amazing that this massacre has now received national and international attention. As you know, President Biden visited Tulsa on June 1st of this year, 2021, and recommended a number of policy changes, major policy changes to deal with systemic racism and oppression. But many of the community activists and the survivors, there are 3 survivors of this massacre who are 107, 106, and 100 years old, were sitting on the edge of their seats, wondering whether the president might mention the word reparations. He did not, but that word reparations is very important to descendants and survivors of this massacre.
Yeah. When we talk about this kind of thing and how important it was in history, I mean, there are 2 things that really happened here. One is the massacre itself, which is bad enough, but you've also got this incredible destruction of a vibrant African American economic community. Talk about what that has meant and what that looks like 100 years later in places like Tulsa.
Okay, so as you know, many of your listeners may know, Greenwood, this all Black community in North Tulsa, on May 30th, 1921, was this prosperous, one of the most prosperous Black communities. In fact, one of the most prosperous communities in the entire country. It had a population of about 10,000 people. It had luxury shops. It had 21 restaurants. It had 30 grocery stores. It had a Black-owned hospital, a Black-owned library. It had a savings and loan. There were several millionaires, luxury hotels. There was a Black man who owned 6 private airplanes. And there were Black people with oil wells. So when Booker T. Washington, the great philosopher and intellectual, visited Greenwood, he called it Negro Wall Street to describe the prosperity there. And of course, now we call it Black Wall Street, but it was a wealthy, self-contained community of Black people where the dollar circulated 9-10 times before it left the community. During that massacre, white mobs descended on this community and destroyed it. They destroyed nearly 35 square blocks. More than 1,200 homes and businesses owned by Black people were destroyed. Airplanes took to the air and they dropped turpentine bombs on it. So on June 1st, 1921, it looked like a bomb had gone off there. It was a complete and utter devastation. Walter White of the NAACP called it in sheer brutality and willful destruction of life and property. It was without parallel in American history. So there have been it did rebuild, Greenwood did rebuild, and it was later destroyed by urban renewal. A highway cut through it. And then with integration, people began shopping outside of the community. So, but it looks like now it's reduced to about a block and a half.
Wow. So I also want to talk about how personal your connection is to this story. This is your story in many ways.
Well, I say my people are from Oklahoma, and my people are from Oklahoma. My great grandmother lived in Tulsa. My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, was born in Boley, which is an all Black town about 60 miles away from Tulsa. Many listeners may know that Oklahoma had a great number of all Black towns. So my grandmother was born in Boley. My dad lives in Tulsa now, which is where he built his church. And it was on a visit to my dad in 2018. I said to my dad, let's go have lunch on Black Wall Street. And we were having lunch at a soul food cafe. I noticed that Black Wall Street was being gentrified. There was a minor league baseball stadium, a yoga studio, a gleaming luxury apartment complex. And there were all the signs of gentrification in this site of this horrible massacre, which Black activists say is sacred ground. So my connection to Tulsa, again, goes back to my family. And then as a journalist, I began reporting the story back in 2018. I wrote my first story about the Tulsa Race Massacre. It landed on the front page of the Washington Post in September 2018. And 2 days later, the mayor of Tulsa was at a community meeting where he was talking about development in North Tulsa. And that's when Reverend Turner, who was pastor at Vernon AME Church, stood up. He held a copy of my story and he said to the mayor, "You would not have this land to develop had there not been a massacre. What will you do about it?" And it was during that meeting that the mayor announced that he would reopen a search for mass graves, which the city found in October 2020. And just yesterday, they found in the pit more than 25 coffins. Wow. And just yesterday, this is breaking news, they began exhuming the the remains, where they will take the remains to a lab for testing, and a forensic anthropologist will examine the remains for any signs of trauma, any gunshot wounds, or any charring or burning that might indicate that these remains are connected to the massacre of 1921.
Wow. I mean, it's just incredible, the kind of pain that gets recalled when you think about the things that we're doing now. They're necessary. We've got to be able to front these things much more actively in American life. But I can't imagine being a resident there in Tulsa and watching this literally come back up out of the ground.
It is a very emotional time for many of the descendants and survivors as the city searches for these mass graves in the city, and as the country, I guess, comes to terms with its history that includes complete, utter destruction of Black communities, barbaric violence that was committed against Black people. And only now are many people learning about these massacres and lynchings that occurred in cities across this country. Your listeners may know that much of this oppressive history was whitewashed out of textbooks. So many people didn't know about it, and very smart people didn't know about the Tulsa Race Massacre until Watchmen aired just last year, starring Regina King. And it opened with a scene recreating the Tulsa Race Massacre, when airplanes are dropping bombs and white mobs are shooting at Black people indiscriminately. Regina King tweeted that a number of people wrote the show and asked whether this was real. And she actually tweeted out one of my stories saying, yes, it was real. It happened. It wasn't fiction. You know, it wasn't a chapter in a book. It really happened to Black people, not only in Tulsa, but it happened in Washington, D.C., Chicago, East St. Louis, Illinois, Omaha, Nebraska. One of the worst massacres occurred in Elaine, Arkansas during the summer of 1919, which James Weldon Johnson called Red Summer. So National Geographic is releasing a film on June 18th called Rise Again, Tulsa and Red Summer. And it'll feature my reporting, but we examined the massacres that occurred during Red Summer that led to the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre.